Next speaker is Jack Kantola. He spent the majority of his career running manufacturing companies, both domestically and in England. He credits Toastmasters with giving him the communication and leadership skills he needed to be successful in business. Approaching 80 years on this earth, Jack has learned many lessons from life's experiences. Today, Jack will tell us about a lesson he learned when he was asked to move to England as managing director of Microdot Aerospace Limited. Jack is fulfilling assignment number 2 from Pathways Level 2. Jack's speech is entitled Victim or Victor. Speaking for 5 to 7 minutes, please help me welcome Jack Kantola.
I learned a really valuable lesson back in 1984. My boss called me into his office one day and said, "We'd like to have you move to England to become the managing director of Microdot Aerospace Limited, an operation that we had just west of London." Fellow Toastmasters, most welcome guests, and Mr. Toastmaster. I was excited about the aspect of moving and living in England, but at the same time I had a lot of apprehension. First thing I did was ask my boss, "Do you have a contract? Can I see a contract?" He said, "Well, no, we don't have one, but we're going to write one. We're going to put one together." This was like in October of 1984. Well, October went by, November went by, December went by, and every time I asked, they said, "No, we're still working on it." And so finally, in the beginning of January, I had a conversation with my mentor, and she said, "Why don't you write your own contract?" And I'm going, never thought of that. I mean, who would even think about writing your own contract when you're working with a multi-million-dollar company who has a lot of resources? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. So I called my friend Roger, who worked at Allianz Life Insurance. He was a friend from my Winnebago days, and he was an HR manager for Allianz Life Insurance. And I said, "Have you ever sent anybody overseas?" And he said, "Yeah, we just did. We just sent the guy to Germany." I said, "Well, could you make me a copy, send me a copy of the contract, and just mark out, black out the bits you don't want me to see?" He said, "Sure." So a few days later, that thing arrived in the mail. Of course, it was 1984. We didn't have the internet. And so then I went to Joe, our HR manager, and I said, "Joe, how are you doing on the contract?" He said, "Well, I've got a lot of stuff. I've got a lot of bits pulled together, but I haven't started writing yet." I said, "Could I get copies of the bits that you put together?" And he said, "Sure." So he had his secretary make me copies of all the bits, which was quite a stack of stuff. And then I went to the accounting department, borrowed the only Apple II computer we had in the whole organization on a Friday, took the bits, my contract from Roger, and the Apple II computer, and went home, sequestered myself in the office, and began writing my contract. Well, reading the information in the bits and in his contract, I realized the significance and the importance of having a contract. Things that I didn't even think about, like what happens if I die when I'm overseas. Does the company say, "Well, there you go, you know, have a nice day" to my wife, and then leave me there? What do I do about my daughter's education? She was in public school here, but she couldn't go into public school in England because she was a sophomore in high school. She had to go to a private school. What about that? What about exchange rate adjustments? Because the exchange rate at that point in time was like $1.12. When I came home, it was $1.85. Big difference. So I sat for that weekend and wrote the contract. I wrote it and typed it out as a ready-to-sign contract. And then I'm going, what do? How do I approach my boss with this thing without seeming to be too arrogant? And he solved the problem for me because we were going to Chicago for a corporate meeting, and he called me, he said, I had Joan, my secretary, book aisles across seating on the aircraft. And we flew out of Long Beach, California, and once we got leveled off in the air, he reached into his briefcase and he pulled out 8 or 10 sheets of yellow legal pad paper with hand scratching all over it, and handed it across to me and said, here, look at this, see what you think. I in turn reached into my briefcase, pulled out a ready-to-sign contract, handed it to him and said, here, you look at this and see what you think. Well, needless to say, the ultimate contract that I had was a slightly modified version of the one I had written. Amazingly enough, there were a few things in the contract that they changed. For instance, I asked for exchange rate adjustment at $1.12, and they changed it to $1.32. I can live with that. They did a few things like that. But also, they changed some of the things in the contract to my advantage. Now, you know, when I was sitting there in that office, I was not writing the contract to the company's advantage. I made sure everything slanted my way. Things like, my son was just going into college and he was staying here. And I argued that, well, gee, if we were living in California, he would be living at home. So it's only reasonable that you would pay his room and board. And they agreed. My daughter went into a private school in England. They paid all of her tuition. They gave us 2 trips home a year for my daughter, my wife, and I, and they gave a trip to England for my son. That was included in the contract. Now, I could have just let the company put the thing together, something you would expect them to do. But in retrospect, if by the time it was time for me to go to England and I had no contract, and I found myself just west of London without a contract, how do you think my bargaining position would have been? Pretty awful. And being over there without a contract, there would have been a constant discussion and argument about what they should cover and what they shouldn't. So I'm telling you, my friends, that if you're in a situation where you feel uncomfortable that way, recognize that you have more power than you could imagine. Recognize that you have the ability to take things into your hands and not become a victim, but to become a victor.